Hi, and welcome to the second half of the 81st episode in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. And today we're going to return to Turkey. We haven't talked about Turkey since the World War II special around Christmas. So it's been a long time coming, and we're going to take Turkey from the Ataturk period through İnönü's first term as prime minister and through the Menderes prime ministry if we have enough time. So here are the rules for those of you who are unfamiliar. This is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the subjects that we're going to be discussing today. That said, this is going to be a secular presentation, meaning that I'm not going to try to take a side on any of these issues and just sort of walk you through the history. I also want to say that these topics, especially when we're talking about Islamic State, can be extremely sensitive. So let's be respectful to the topic. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. I'll also have a question and answer section after both 81A and after 81B to address questions that you may have, and I'll more than willing to listen to spoken questions at that time. What I like to say is that these presentations are a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know that much, a 101, I'll catch you up. And if you know something already about the situation, I'll probably still tell you things you didn't know. I also have what I call a 2-hour hard stop, which means that if at 9 p.m. Eastern time, if I haven't gotten to all my slides, that's okay. It's just going to go into next week. And wouldn't you know, next week is just the continuation of this presentation anyway, where we're going to talk about the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s in Turkey, perhaps get to the 21st century, and then we will have a final presentation that will take us all the way to the present. If I put dates below a person, it is typically their years of service, especially if we're talking about political figures. If we're talking about thought leaders, people who never held a political office, then those are their years of life. And this will be recorded just like all the other 80 entries in the Middle Eastern and Islamic history series, which you can watch at our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel to constantly see all of the different videos from all of the different groups that we have at History Mostly Ancient Discussions. And of course, you can follow all of the presentations in this podcast. And if you enjoy what we do and you want to be part of the Zoom, that's fantastic. We'd love to have you. Please join our meetup and you can get updated as to when all of our presentations are. There are other meetups that may have some of our Zooms, but don't have all of them because there are a number of different presenters here at History Mostly Ancient. And finally, we have Premium Zoom, Premium Meetup, and Premium YouTube, which all cost us a pretty premium. So we appreciate anything you can do to help us keep the lights on. That said, we'll continue to put up these presentations for free, but help is always appreciated, and you can send that money to the PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee links below. All right, so just sort of to refresh ourselves on the story of Turkey. Turkey entered World War I as the Ottoman Empire, a very diverse state with numerous different ethnic groups, social groups, and so on. But the process of nationalism, and that, as well as the other pieces of the empire being cut off by the Allied powers. So, as I was saying, Turkey entered the war as this large multinational, multi-ethnic power and was stripped of its territories as a result of the conflict. And after the various treaties were signed, Turkey was subject to the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was signed with Germany, but Turkey was subjected to its own, the Ottoman Empire was subject to its own treaties. And we have to sort of understand that the Ottoman Empire was a willing capitulate to the Western powers. But Ataturk didn't represent the Ottoman Empire. He represented an insurgency against the Ottoman Empire to force the Allies out. And so that's this entire idea of the Greco-Turkish War and the larger Turkish War of Independence, where the Turks literally fought against the Kuvayi İnzibatiye, or the disciplinary forces, meaning the governmental military, and the military coordinated by Mustafa Kemal was able to crush the government and therefore become the ruling group within Turkey as a result of the independence war. Now, there are a few things that are worth pointing out about how the independence war ended up working in Turkey's favor. The first one is that Turkey actually reached out to the Soviet Union long before many of the Western powers were willing to. And so you had two countries which were not recognized by the West, the Republic of Turkey and the USSR. And they recognized each other, and the Soviet Union provided 80 million lira in order for the Turkish Republic to be able to become ascendant once again. And the Treaty of Kars reallocated a significant portion of the territory that originally had been held by the Russian Empire from 1878 till 1914 to Turkey, in exchange for Turkish recognition of the Soviet Union and the return of Turkish soldiers back across the border. But this created a long-standing friendship between Ataturk and the Russian government. You can see him there with Voroshilov in the 1930s. And at this point, we have the emergence of a successor, really, in Ataturk's midst, and that's İsmet İnönü, at that time called İsmet Pasha, because he hadn't, the last name law hadn't come into existence yet. But he was the primary negotiator for the Turks in Lausanne, creating the treaty that defined the territory of the modern Republic of Turkey. And both Ataturk and İnönü were part of this new idea which is called Kemalism. And Kemalism is hard to put a finger on in the same way that fascism or communism as ideological constructs are easier to put an idea on. There's certainly certain fascist elements of Kemalism, the idea of order, state organization of industry, the idea of a national people, the idea of rampant nationalism. There's all of these concepts that match up with fascism, but at a fundamental level, we should understand that Kemalism wasn't a fascist policy. In fact, it wasn't clear exactly what it was at all. To the extent that we can say that fascism has core ideas, the Altı Ok, or the 6 arrows, those ideas are constantly reinterpreted and reunderstood by Kemalists in much the same way that the main points of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party in the United States are constantly reevaluated and understood. So you can have a lot of different perspectives and still sit within that tent, which made it incredibly malleable and able to accommodate a large number of people. If we're talking about the first arrow, which is Cumhuriyetçilik, or republicanism, this is the idea that the Ottoman Empire, its imperial rulership, its hereditary monarchy, the idea of the caliph, who is an appointed religious governor, all these things have to go, and Turkey is going to become a republic ruled by people who are chosen by the voters. Now, within Ataturk's life, there was never really a meaningful election in the sense of somebody who represented a fundamentally different principle surviving for very long. And we'll talk about that in a bit. You also have halkçilik, or this idea of popular sovereignty, which, while true in the sense that people did have control, increasing control over their lives, especially women, when we're talking about women's rights to vote, women's rights to have only to have no sister wives, the possibility of female child custody, and so on. We have to understand that this popular sovereignty, or halkçilik, and its corresponding brother, milliyetçilik, the idea of nationhood, were top-down impositions. These were creations of the government, not the creations of a national movement to bring all these people together. And so what ends up happening is that this top-down movement creates a set of educated Turks who believe this and who go along with this. But at the same time, since it's not a popular movement, you start creating a distinction between the views in the countryside and the views in the major cities. In fact, by the time of Ataturk's death, less than 1% of all Turkish villages, for example, had been electrified, whereas electricity was quite commonplace in Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, and other major cities. You also have the creation of nationalist myths in order to create this idea of nationhood. And there were some ideas like, for example, that the Hittites, who historically lived in what is today Anatolia, are the ancestors of the modern Turks, which they may well be, but if they are, they were culturally converted by the invaders. You also have the idea of Sun language theory, which is the idea that all languages descend from Turkish. So you can imagine the kind of arrogance that it creates within a national group if they believe that they are the ones who invented all language. So when it comes to secularism or laiklik, this is probably the most important of Atatürk's policies, especially in the perspective of İsmet İnönü. Atatürk did a significant amount, not just to remove religion from control of public life, right? Unseating not only the caliph, but also the entire judiciary of qadis that followed him, and replacing it with the Swiss legal code. He wanted to make the religion subservient to the state. And so he created the Diyanet ministry, which is effectively a government ministry that tells who tells imams what speech to give on Fridays, and closed down a significant number of mosques until those mosques could be reformed in line with Kemalist principles. We also see that secularism comes to represent protection of the minority religions, specifically Judaism, Orthodox Christianity, Greek Orthodox Christianity, and Armenians, because those are the religions spoken about in the Treaty of Lausanne, having the rights to follow their own religion in a majority Muslim country. These groups, of course, especially the Orthodox Christians and the Armenians, who were recovering from the genocides of World War I, it made them very worried that such a situation could recur again. One other aspect of laicism was that symbols of the religion in the public square had to be removed. So one such action was the changing of the adhan. So the adhan, or the Muslim call to prayer, is typically said in Arabic and has a specific cadence, it has a specific history. Atatürk banned the adhan in Arabic and required the adhan to be given in Turkish. He also had the Quran translated into Turkish so that it could become more acceptable. Atatürk also pioneered this idea of devletçilik, or state-run capitalism, that industry would have loans given to it by the government in order to expand its process. The government would start choosing members of the board, but by and large, it left these growing industries as private entities. And of course, the last of the 6 arrows is revolutionism. It's kind of hard to translate inkılapçılık, but the idea was that it was very similar to what U.S. President Thomas Jefferson had said, which is that the country needs a revolution every 20 years in order to cycle through new blood. After we talk about Turkey for today and the next 2 weeks, I think we'll all come away with the conclusion that it's better that we don't have a revolution every 20 years. But there was this idea that the Turkish system was constantly in a state of revolution, constantly in a state of growth, new things were changing, and that the linkages to the past were what was holding the Turkish civilization back. They needed to keep revolutioning every time, and this established a role for the military as the perpetuators and generators of said revolutions in order to guarantee the political system. There's a question of, might it be legitimate to say that unlike most familiar fascist regimes, Ataturk was successful in developing a sense of nationalism without fomenting hatreds against internal populations, thus without any widespread sense of victimized murderous outrage? I would disagree with that. He created a sense of nationalism, sure, around the Turkish identity, but his regime absolutely fed upon and promoted the hatreds of other populations in Turkey. I think the Kurds are sort of an example that speaks for themselves. But of course, we're also going to get into genocide denial, right? Which starts with Ataturk. It's not a new thing. So one of Ataturk's distinguishing elements of foreign policy was what he called peace in the world. Peace at home, peace in the world. And his view was the Turks had fought their war for independence. They won their war for independence in 1923, and that should be the last Turkish war ever. Turkey should be a friend to all nations and an enemy only to those enemies that are opposed to Turkish interests. And in fact, this may sound surprising given the situation today, Ataturk actually cultivated a very strong relationship with Greece, despite having fought them in that Turkish War of Independence quite brutally. And Eleftherios Venizelos, the president of Greece for a while, and some of his successors were close confidants of Ataturk. Ataturk, of course, as we saw, also spoke to Voroshilov as late as 1933. He had cordial relations with Tsar Boris III. No, sorry. He was worried about Tsar Boris III of Bulgaria. And so he formed a Balkans alliance, the Balkan Pact of 1934, and he formed the Sa'ad-Abad Pact in 1938. Both of these pacts would be ideas that would be able to be used by Turkish leaders in the future. The Balkan Pact focusing on Turkey's north and west, and the Sa'ad-Abad Pact focusing on Turkey's south and east, showing the strategic position that Turkey was in along the crossroads between Europe and the Middle East. We also have the situation of Turkey still dealing with the remnant of Western imperialism, in that, for example, the city of Mosul, which we know is in northern Iraq today, was debated between the Turks and the British to such an extent that Ataturk sent Shefik Özdemir, a Turkish general, to assist the Kurds in their rebellion, the rebellion led by Barzanji in 1923. One of the important things to take away from this argument is not just that the British were trying to seek petroleum in Mosul, which was what was going on, but that one of the arguments that Inannu uses is that Kurds and Turks were actually the same race, which is why he considered the northern part of Iraq today to be part of what should be in Turkey. And our current theme that we'll investigate as we move forward with Turkey is the idea of political opposition. Now, Ataturk wanted, or at least said that he wanted, political opposition, but the problem is that he wanted an opposition that wouldn't oppose any of the fundamental reforms he was trying to do, any of those 6 arrows. Considering how all-encompassing those policies are and how critical they are in terms of the growth and development that Ataturk was striving to achieve, it seems kind of impossible that that could happen. Qasim Karabekir, a general who had fought in the war, in both the First World War and the Turkish War of Independence, tried to create the Taraki Perver Cumhuriyet Firkası, or the Progressive Republican Party, which was a little bit more religious than Ataturk's, found himself arrested, so that way he couldn't continue that. But a little bit later, Ataturk reached out to his friend Fethi Okyar, who you can see in that picture, to create a new political party called the Serbest Cumhuriyet Firkası, or the Liberal Republican Party. The Liberal Republican Party didn't have much difference in terms of policy with the Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, the Republican People's Party, or the CHP. But the fact that it was any opposition, meant that they got a significant number of votes. But when it came time for them to be able to manifest what they desired in parliament, Ataturk came down on them and decided that this experiment had gone too far. He shut down the party, and Fethi Okyar believes that Ataturk to this day betrayed him by setting him up to fail. As I mentioned, within the context of modern Turkey, the Kurds were viewed as a Turkish group. They, despite the fact that they speak a language wholly unrelated to Turkish, they have a totally different lifestyle than the Turks, and they have a much more Iranic culture than the Turks do. But Ataturk wanted to subject them to the forces of centralization and organization, as well as limiting their access to religion, which was part of his laiklik reforms, and Kurds tended to be more religious. So what you end up having is a rebellion led by Sheikh Said among the Kurds, and the Turkish modern military crushing it, deporting them, banning their language, and ostracizing them politically. Probably the greatest crime during Ataturk's presidency, prime ministry, at least that even most Turks who are fond of Ataturk will mention, is the massacre at Dersim, where many Kurdish citizens were both killed on the ground and killed by aerial bombardment. And of course, Ataturk begins the policy of Armenian genocide denial, and Greek genocide denial, and Assyrian genocide denial within the context of the Ottoman Empire. Now, Ataturk's position was not consistently this way. It actually changed over time. If we look at his views right before the Turkish War of Independence, he thought that perhaps recognition of the atrocities could be counterweighed by the British and the French respecting a higher degree of Turkish independence or autonomy. When he realized that these allegations would be would be used as a way of weakening Turkey, of limiting the ability of Turks to promote their national identity and their statehood, he started to be less inclined towards the human rights perspective of recognizing genocide and seeking peace and reconciliation, and toward the perspective of seeking territorial and national security. It's for that reason why he turned a blind eye to a number of the massacres that occurred in the wake of the Turkish War of Independence. For example, in the south of Turkey, when parts of southern Turkey were under French control, Armenians returned to those regions, including the town of Hajin. When Turkish forces took control of the city, they began to massacre the Armenians who had returned there after having already left because of the Armenian genocide. So you have events like this, and Ataturk does not categorize them as being based in this sense of Turkishness and the violations of Turkishness. The last thing to discuss is the personality cult. And this is one of the interesting things. The Ataturk personality cult existed to a certain degree while he was alive, but it definitely grew significantly after he died. And I would say further that the personality cult was often promoted and developed by those who actually had fundamentally opposite policies to him in such a way that they could distance themselves from their critics by saying how much they revere Ataturk. You can see that, for example, with the kind of veneration that Erdogan gives to Ataturk, and we're not going to talk about it, but you could also see it in the way that Menderes, the prime minister, the prime minister in the 1950s, talks about Ataturk and how many statues of him he builds. There are questions of why didn't the Armenians leave Hajin when the French left? Some of them left. Some of them thought that perhaps it's a different military, right? The military put together by Ataturk was in many ways combined of former Ottoman soldiers, but they were built by village councils. They were a completely different construction, and maybe the Armenians thought this might be different. Maybe they thought, finally, we're home. We're not going to leave our home again. There's a whole variety of reasons, but a significant portions of Armenians in the south of Turkey fled the Turkish soldiers when they came, and they became known as the Fort Pavang, or the Armenians in Aleppo. And until the Syrian civil war, there was a significant Armenian population in Aleppo, and there still remains a significant Armenian population in Lebanon as a result of the people fleeing not just the original genocide, but the massacres during the Turkish War of Independence. So while Ataturk was president, especially during his latter days, Ataturk spent less and less time in the minutiae of ruling the country and spent more of it sort of relaxing in his own home, especially as we get closer to 1936, 1937. By late 1937, he actually gets ill, and most of the functions of government have to pass to somebody else. But during those later years, when Ataturk is spending more time at home, you have this sort of weird dichotomy that starts happening. İsmet İnönü is clearly the successor to Ataturk and inherits much of his prestige. And of course, İnönü is a war hero himself. His surname is based on one of the battles that he won during the Turkish War of Independence. So he's no flower in his own right. But the problem is that whenever Ataturk basically gives him a command, he has to go along with it. And what ended up happening is that as Ataturk spent more time in his house, he had what İnönü jokingly called the kitchen cabinet, which was a group of wealthy industrialists and friends that Ataturk invited over to his house and would talk politics to him in the kitchen. And so Ataturk would hear about one idea or another, one harebrained scheme or another, and would ask İnönü to implement it. Now, İnönü's scheme was not to do those things. And so in 1937, they had a parting of the ways, where İnönü basically told Ataturk that he couldn't govern anymore if Ataturk was going to undercut him at every turn. And another member of the revolution, Celal Bayar, became prime minister of Turkey for the last year of Ataturk's life. But once Ataturk had died and had been buried, İnönü returned to the parliament, and there was no significant opposition to him becoming the next prime minister of Turkey. There were some people who would have wished İnönü not to become the dominant power. But those individuals were greatly saddened when a number of other generals from the Turkish War of Independence simply refused to run as potential candidates. And Jalal Bayar put his strength behind İsmet İnönü and ceded him the prime ministry. Now, there's a question as to why it is that Mustafa Kemal's rapprochement with Greece didn't take. It did take. It became undone during the 1960s because of the Cyprus question. So during the 1930s, 40s, 50s, Turkish-Greek relations are generally good. You start moving into the late 50s, early 60s, things start heating up because of Cyprus. So when İnönü came to power, he declared himself the Milli Chef, or the national chief. And in that way, he distinguished himself from Ataturk in that he would never become that eternal leader of Turkey as Ataturk had been, but he would take that role as a national leader. And he gathered all power to him, such that he was able to maintain the one-party state that had been created by the mid-1930s and retained a one-party state until 1945. He was a firm believer in the devletçilik idea of Ataturk's, that state capitalism idea. And so he spent a significant portion of his time trying to assert power over various corporations, centralizing them and organizing them. And he also improved the educational system. One particular example of this is the story of Hasan Ali Yücel. Dr. Yücel was a leader in education, and he created what were called the village institutes. Under Ataturk, as under İnönü, most of the growth and development that took place in Turkey took place in the major cities. And the countryside, where over 80% of the Turkish population lived, was slow to gain literacy, slow to develop electrified regions, slow to fully integrate into modernity. And Yücel was doing what he could in order to build schools in these regions so that young children had a chance of reading and therefore becoming active parts of the Turkish economy. Another really great achievement that İnönü managed to make for himself was the Montreux Convention, which was that in 1936, he reached out to the great powers, especially the British, and was able to get them to recognize full Turkish control over the straits. That is the Bosporus in northern Turkey and the Dardanelles in western Turkey. Those are the two straits that you need to pass through to get from the Black Sea to the Aegean and later the Mediterranean. And this changed the situation from what it had been before, where the imperial powers were able to maintain positions and guarantee the ability to move through the straits. This was a huge assertion of Turkish national pride and national sovereignty, and was one that İnönü was well regarded for. As we've talked about on the Syrian side, in 1938, İnönü was able to launch an invasion of Alexandretta, which was a region of Syria with a substantial Turkish minority. And the key element here is that as we're moving into a World War II preamble, there's a worry among Britain and France that Turkey might be aligned with Nazi Germany. Now, it had been the case that the Ottoman Empire was an ally of the German Empire, but İnönü was quite wary of the Germans dragging the Turks into another war that would be cataclysmic for them. And furthermore, the party that Turkey cared most about, actually, in terms of political position at this point, was the Soviet Union, given that friendship that Ataturk had created starting in 1921. And there had been a 10-year treaty of friendship that was renewed from 1925 to 1935, and then again 1935 to 1945. So it was really upon the Soviet Union that Turkey was pinning its hopes, not so much Germany. But to avoid that possibility occurring at all, especially with Nazism becoming more and more threatening to France, Alexandretta was ceded to Turkey, despite the Syrians having a legitimate claim to the territory as well. And so we enter World War II with a very strange situation in Turkey relative to much of the rest of the Middle East. Since Turkey is an independent state, as opposed to a lot of the other states in the Middle East, which are independent on paper but are functionally quasi-colonies, you have the Turkish Foreign Ministry trying to deal with all the different groups. And as I mentioned, Shukru Saracoğlu, who was the minister in the first half of World War II, wanted to take a pro-Soviet position and also saw a possible alliance with the Western states. But this became completely undone when the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August of 1939. That was a pact that put the Soviets and the Nazi Germans on the same side. But wanting to appear that Turkey would stay neutral, at least to a certain degree, he signed the tripartite agreement with the British and the French in October of 1939. So he would maintain relations with the West to a certain degree, while still being on the lookout for the Soviet Union. But them siding with Nazi Germany was definitely a worry in their view. Saracoğlu realized that in order to stay out of the war, though, he would need to create a relationship with Germany, especially after Germany defeated the French. And so starting in 1941, he signs the German-Turkish Treaty of Friendship and follows that with the Clodius Agreement, whereby Turkey will supply chromite to the Germans in exchange for maintaining this friendship. And as part of that friendship, Turkey denies Britain and France, despite that tripartite alliance, permission to enter its territory for invasions of Greece or Iraq. In fact, the Turkish government starts to build up its military at this point in order to avoid the possibility that either the Western powers or the Nazis will decide that it's not worth working with a Turkey that keeps jumping from side to side, and it would be better to just try and invade and take it over. And so the Turkish military increases by a factor of 10 over the course of this war, and Turkey ends the war with 1.5 million soldiers. Given that the Turkish economy was heavily dependent on consumption and was based primarily around invested money in technology, the Turkish economy was in a very bad place during the war, given all of the extra spending that had to happen in order to increase the size of the military and resist both the possibility of Nazi and Western invasion. In order to remediate this problem, and feeding upon traditional stereotypes about minorities, İnönü allowed for the creation of the Varlık Vergisi. The Varlık Vergisi, or the wealth tax, was a tax that was imposed on all subjects of the Ottoman Empire, but it was not imposed on them equally. It was started in 1943 and was abolished in 1944. So it started in November of 1942 and abolished in March of 1944. This tax was particularly horrendous against Armenians, Jews, and Greek Orthodox, who had a disproportionate ownership of the means of production within the Turkish state. And so many of them were forced to sell at liquidation prices their entire businesses, their homes, in order to pay for these taxes. And you can see the fundamental difference in percentage when you compare what Muslims typically had to pay with what they typically had to pay. And those who couldn't pay were sent to labor camps like Ashkale. And it might sound surprising, like given that negative treatment of minorities under the Varlık Vergisi, as a general matter, Turkish treatment of Jews was much more positive than pretty much anywhere in Europe. Jewish scientists had already come to Istanbul as part of Ataturk's acceptance of them in 1933. And so these German Jews survived the war in Turkey. You also had the Jewish Agency for Israel in the location closest to Israel itself, as well as being close to Europe to coordinate refugees escaping from the Jewish Holocaust going on in Nazi-occupied Europe. And you had people like Selahattin Ülkümen, who was the Turkish consul in the Greek island of Rhodes, and who helped any Jew with Turkish citizenship, or who could be effectively shown to have Turkish citizenship, out of the island of Rhodes, and is recognized in the Jewish Yad Vashem's Righteous Gentiles garden for his contributions against the extermination of the Jews in Europe. So you have these completely bifurcated situations that are going on at the same time, motivated by fundamentally different concerns. The Fatah Farghisi is motivated by economic issues and increasing resentment from the large-scale militarized draft. And these other things are done. In the case of Selahattin Ülkümen, I think it is his personality. But in the case of the Jewish Agency for Israel and the German Jewish scientists, they're done to bolster the Turkish economy, both for internal consumption and for external consumption. One of the strange situations that occurred because of Turkey's constant pivoting during World War II to appearing more pro-Western in 1940, to appearing more pro-German in 1942, to appearing more pro-Western in 1944, is that you had a swing whereby the political leanings most echoing of the group that they're trying to impress come to the fore. And so in 1942, you have the first real Turanism descriptions, especially led by Nihal Atsız. And Atsız is quite famous for believing that there is a superiority to the Turkish race, and that the Turkish race is the one that exists through all Turkish-speaking peoples, much of Central Asia, parts of Siberia, and that these areas were part of Turan, this historically great Turkish civilization, and that there should be an expansionary war led by Turks in order to bring all of these territories under the control of Turkish leadership. Now, of course, during 1942, when they were courting the Nazis, this was promoted because it showed a parallel between the Turkish claim of genetic prowess with the Aryan claim of German prowess, and the areas that the Turanists cared about were areas the Nazis just did not care about. Those were, in the view of the Nazis, inferior peoples. When they're shifting in 1944 to a more pro-Allied perspective, especially seeing that the Allies were going to win the war, individuals like Nihal Atsız were part of a governmental attempt to cleanse the state. And so they were put on trial for their racism and Turanism. Now, I won't argue that their views are racist. Their views certainly are racist. So that their views aren't racist. Their views certainly are racist. But we should also point out that there are certain racial aspects to the Turkish Republic government, especially at that time. And there were certain positions in government, for example, the prime minister, that couldn't be held by any non-Muslim citizen of Turkey. And Nihal Atsız said that the only difference between the Turkish state and him was the degree of the discrimination, not the kind of discrimination. We also have, especially in 1944, the Soviet Union becoming more bombastic about how it wanted to take territory from Turkey. Turkey, of course, had not contributed in any meaningful way to the war, but the Soviet Union had, and so it felt that it should be able to not only take back the territories that it had in the beginning of 1915, but all the territories that it had taken within the wider World War I. And part of the racism Turanism trials was to at least put a little bit of dash a little bit of water on that fire from the Soviet side, because then the Westerners might put more pressure on the Soviet Union not to expand into Turkish territory. And so the Soviet desire to expand Turkish territory continues after the war. So in 1945, in February, Inönü declares war on Nazi Germany, but he doesn't actually do anything. The entire declaration of war is strictly for international consumption, because one of the rules of the United Nations is that no country could be a founding member of the United Nations if it hadn't been an ally during the war. So they became an ally during the war. But as you move into the post-war environment and the beginning of the Cold War, we begin to have a situation in Turkey that's much more extreme than what we've seen elsewhere in the Middle East. In most areas of the Middle East, the Cold War absolutely plays an important role, and we've talked about that. But because of Turkey's proximity to Eastern Europe, because of the strategic nature of the Straits, because of having a direct border with the Soviet Union, Turkey has a much closer affinity to the events of the Cold War than most of the other Middle Eastern countries. The possible exception, of course, being Iran, because of its border, again, with the Soviet Union. So we begin to see agitation from the Soviets again, that they get those eastern provinces. And you can see, for example, in this map, I'm just showing you for what territories they wanted to annex to Georgian SSR. So this is a significant portion of Turkish territory, and the Turks do not want to cede that. The Soviets are also pushing that the Montreux Convention of 1936 be abrogated, and the Soviet Union be allowed to put a military base in the Straits, so that way they can coordinate whether or not warships can go through the Straits, and therefore effectively give Russia a significant amount of control over that territory. Not surprisingly, Turkey tries to seek a different path. And so Inönü, throughout the 1940s, listens very closely to what Truman is saying on the American side. And Truman, in 1947, issues what he calls the Truman Doctrine, referring to the Greek Civil War, which was going on between a military and communist insurgents, both of whom had fought together to expel the Nazis, but were now fighting each other. Truman wanted to give $100 million of support to the Greek military, and to prevent communism from jumping from Greece to Turkey, $100 million as well to Turkey, to prevent communist insurgents from growing up in that country. Now, Turkey didn't have a long-term problem with communists. The last communists were expelled from the country in 1925, but Truman's perspective was that a wealthier country has less of a breeding ground for those communists to come from. And so Turkey graciously took the money and began to move more and more into the Western sphere. And we see payments between 1949 and 1952, alongside other Marshall Plans, to be at least $137 million, if not twice that, depending on how you count it. Another part of the US alliance that will sort of come to the fore for those of you who know what happens in 1962, the United States in 1959 began to put missiles on Turkish territory, especially in the cities of Izmir and Incirlik. Missiles like this Jupiter missile. And the reason why it's connected to the Cuban Missile Crisis is that Soviets got the idea of putting missiles in Cuba in direct striking range of the United States, because the United States have put missiles in Turkey in direct striking range of the Soviet Union. And in fact, one of the concessions, which wasn't admitted until significantly later during the Cuban Missile Crisis, was the concession that the United States would remove the missiles from Turkey in order to put the Soviet Union more at ease. But because of the West's defense, the Montreux Convention, the Marshall Plan, and increasing American militarization in the region, Turkey definitely chooses to go full force on the US side of the alliance. And so Turkey ends up doing things that are very different than a lot of other Middle Eastern countries. The first one is that they actually recognize Israel. Starting in 1949, along with the receiving of Marshall Plan aid, the Turkish government recognizes the state of Israel. And that puts it at great odds with a number of the Muslim majority countries in the region, which of course rejected the state. And Turkey and Israel began to coordinate as allies in the periphery, countries surrounding those Arab dictatorships, being able to coordinate in terms of military strategy and organization. We also see that during the 1950s, Egypt moves more and more in the communist vector, right? We've talked about how the Soviet Union funded the Aswan High Dam. We've talked about by the time of the War of Attrition in 1967 to 1970, there are actually Soviet soldiers fighting on the Egyptian side. Turkey was profoundly in the Western sphere, and although there were attempts in the late 1940s during the reign of King Farouk to bring the two countries together into some kind of alliance, both countries wouldn't have it. That said, Turkey was not shy about making alliances. As I mentioned, there's the alliance of the periphery, but there was also the Baghdad the Baghdad Club. Wow, I can't speak today. The Baghdad Pact, which involved many of the former members of the Sa'ad-Abad Pact. And Turkey also developed a Balkans Pact with Greece and Yugoslavia. In fact, it was the most effective way for the United States to indirectly influence Yugoslav politics. Turkey became extremely anti-communist. And that anti-communism was to such an extent that during the 1950s, especially as you get later in the decade, like 56, 57, Turkey argued that it should invade Syria and overthrow its increasingly Soviet-aligned government. And the United States at that time was still experimenting with coups and had formulated some. If you remember, this was the time of Adib Shishakli, and after him, the restoration of elections under Shukri al-Quwatli and all of these kinds of characters. But the Americans kept launching coups. And so the Americans figured that they would be able to launch a coup and fix Syria. Little did they know that Egypt would invade in 1958 and try and annex it, right? That's the United Arab Republic. In 1958, when the Iraqi monarchy falls, the Turks are again ready to cross the border, and only very strong pleading from the United States meant that they didn't. Turkey justified its attempt at invading Iraq based on the fact that Iraq was a member of the Baghdad Pact. In fact, that's why it was called the Baghdad Pact. But the 1958 Free Officers coup in Iraq that put Abdul Karim Qasim in power was absolutely anti-Western, pro-Soviet lightly, but certainly was not going to continue being a member of the Baghdad Pact because of its Western alliance and leanings. So once we get into this post-war environment, we start having a situation where increasingly Inonu is going to try and sell Turkey as a place the West should be interested in. And also there are changes occurring internally within the country that are causing seams to break within the Kemalist CHP. 4 parliamentarians who are members of the CHP, Rafiq Kuraltan, Adnan Menderes, Jalal Bayar, and Fuat Köprülü, all with Inönü's permission, established what's called the Dürtlü Takrir, or the report of 4. It's kind of hard to translate the term, but they write this report of 4 that argues their new political position. And this new political position comes in the wake of the law for the distribution of land to farmers and establishment of farmers' homesteads. Don't blame the Turks for not having very long legal names. So this law was designed to break up the large landholding establishments and redistribute them. And while this came earlier than a lot of similar laws in the Middle East that we've already looked at, like the ones in Egypt under Nasser, the ones in Iraq under Abdul Karim Qasim, the ones in Syria, the ones in Syria under Salah Jadid. This one was particularly disliked by individuals like Adnan Menderes, who was a person who owned a significant piece of land. And so his opposition party was perhaps more conservative than the CHP and was called the Democrat Party. Don't let the name fool you. As I said, it's a center right to right wing party. And the Democrats realized pretty early on that there was a significant amount of discontent within Turkish society, especially among the rural population. Remember, over 80% of Turkey is still rural at this point, and it's religious. The revolution that had been created by Ataturk was a revolution that occurred mostly in the cities and was mostly agreed to by the people in the cities. The people in the countryside were much less interested in that. And so you had an uprising from that population who had no political representatives to channel it into. And so they channeled it into the Democrat Party, despite the fact that the Democrat Party was not actually promoting their ideals from a fundamental economic perspective. For those of you who are familiar with American politics, you may be familiar with this potential problem, which is, of course, the I vote against my own economic interests issue. And so the Democrat Party was able to get a significant number of these people to support them. And they understood that there were certain lines and they understood that a lot of the frustration that was leading to votes in their favor was coming from people who were in the countryside. And so they began to make a very effective campaign poster, which was a hand stopping people from moving, and it says, Yeter, söz milletindir. Enough, the world belongs to the people. In this way, they were able to appeal to the populist, the popular groups in the rural areas, as well as their point that they would pull a little bit back on the secularism. They would still clearly be a secular party. İnönü would not allow a religious party to run, but he would define his fundamental difference as his opposition to devletçilik, this state-run capitalism, and that he would promote something closer to a laissez-faire economy, maybe some regulation, but not as much state management of the economy as İnönü. Now, that particular issue may have gotten some wealthy supporters to his side, but the poor simply were channeling their frustration with Ataturk's reforms, with İnönü's reforms, into the Democrat Party, which didn't represent any of the benefits. And the Democrats were also dealing with the fact that the war had resulted in significant military expenditures, and the Turkish military still stood at 1.5 million people in 1950, when the Democrat Party won its first victory. It had run in parliamentary elections in 1946 and didn't win, but in 1950, 52% of the votes came in for the Democrat Party, and so Adnan Menderes became the first non-CHP individual to become Prime Minister of Turkey. And we will learn all about his prime ministry next week as we are over time. So questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat while you're gathering those together. And of course, you can always raise hands and talk if you'd rather make your question oral. This is History Mostly Ancient Discussions. You have listened to Middle Eastern Islamic History. I am Richard, and we meet Wednesdays at 7. Next week, we will pick up from here with Adnan Menderes's electoral victory in 1950 and the twists and turns that are going to happen between the Democrats losing power, the CHP coming back in power, the development of the Turkish diaspora in Europe, and the rise of Islamism within the Turkish electorate, all kinds of interesting things as we move our way through the Cold War and its effect on Turkey. Of course, we also have Asian philosophy, which is every Saturday. We discuss European Union security periodically. That's me and Aaron. We've got Jane taking a break this month from her Powerful Women. And of course, we just did our Russo-Ukrainian War series about earlier this month. And so maybe next month or maybe in September, we'll do another Russo-Ukrainian War series. And so questions, comments, concerns. And of course, thank you everybody for the kind words. Mark?
Yeah, Richard, thanks very much. My question is better posed just orally. All right, so when it comes to that tax, that post-World War World War II tax in Turkey that hit the Greeks particularly.
Sure, the Farlık Vergisi.
That to what level was that connected with the anti-Greek pogroms of when Greek businesses were burned down in Istanbul and things like that?
So I think you're thinking of the Istanbul pogrom of 1955.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a decade later.
Oh, okay.
Right. The Farlık Vergisi is in 1942 to 1944, and the Istanbul pogrom is in September of 1955.
Okay.
But they're all connected by these common threads. I'm trying to find the right way to say this. There's the myth in Europe that, or maybe myth is a strong word. There's the essentialization that Jews are a wealthy minority, and that they have, and of course, the myth that goes along with this is that they've acquired their wealth through some sort of nefarious means. That myth in the Turkish world applies to all of the minorities, especially the Greeks. And there are some reasons for that to be true, especially in the post-Independence War situation. Because during the Independence War in 1923, there was the population exchange. And so most Greeks who lived in what is today Turkey went to Greece. The exceptions were for those who were already living in the major cities, Izmir, Istanbul. There were a few other cities that were counted as well. And so those Greeks were allowed to stay. And those Greeks were disproportionately wealthy. And you can see my girlfriend dancing in the screen behind me. So
maybe we should let you go then.
No, it's fine. But so basically, the situation that you end up having, where was that these populations that already existed in Istanbul, in Izmir, were the remnants of the Fanariotes, right? And we talked about them in some of the earlier episodes, like 20-somethings, where these were populations of extremely wealthy Greeks who were connected to the Ottoman leadership and had built successful families within the Fener district. That's where they got the name Fanariotes, in the Fener district in Istanbul. So they had disproportionate ownership of the businesses. They had disproportionate wealth. But for want of a better term, they earned it. Their businesses existed for a long time. And to the degree that it was given to them, it was given to them because of concessions that the Ottoman Empire had made, the capitulations to foreign powers. But those were centuries ago. The money that they had was simply reinvested, reused, and expanded within the context of the Turkish state. But for a lot of people, especially when you realize that Turkey was significantly undereducated, when you realize that a lot of the setting of the percentages of the Farlık Vergisi was done at a local level, as opposed to a national level, those percentages are effective national rates based on all the different local taxes that were applied in different regions and so on, it becomes a lot more apparent that the lack of education, the lack of understanding about how this wealth was acquired, why it was acquired, and how it benefits the Turkish economy overall, led to people being much more easily radicalized against these minorities.
So that would so when that tax applied to the Jews, which was a smaller percentage than the Greeks, that was a bit of a departure from the way the Turks had welcomed, I think it was Romanian Jews, I think, and other Jews, and the traditional, like they took the Jews in 1492 from Spain. They saw them as a resource. So
Right.
this seems like a departure from centuries.
No, I think it very much is. I think that, well, first of all, Jews always, in the Ottoman days, when the jizya was an application, that's before 1850, 1861, yeah, Edict of the Gudhene. So prior to that point, Jews did pay a tax. All minorities paid a tax, the jizya poll tax. So it's not unique for Jews to have it. And in fact, many of the people who criticized the Ferlik Verkisi called it a jizya. And they did it and in the context of Turkey, that was a derogatory term because it would imply that the Turkish government was the Ottoman government as opposed to some sort of modern developed whatever. But it was a departure in that it was so nakedly discriminatory when the entire idea of Turkey was that we are one nation. We are right. We are one. We are ruling through popular sovereignty. We are a republic. Everybody votes. Like the fundamental idea of Turkey is undercut by this kind of policy, whereas the fundamental idea of the Ottoman Empire isn't. Right? You can give shelter to people, but demand high taxes from them. And furthermore, the taxes of the Varlik Farkisi were so high that people literally had to sell everything they owned in order to pay them off. And if they didn't pay them off, even after selling everything, they were sent to labor camps,
right?
Which of course was different.
But it is aligned with the idea that after the end of with the start of the Republic, that everyone within the borders of that nation state of Turkey are Turks, no matter if they're Greeks or Kurds or whoever. Now, congratulations, you are all Turks now.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's a very difficult discussion in Turkey now because it's Article 66 of the current Turkish constitution, but it has moved around because Turkey's had 5 or 6 different constitutions since 1923. But Article 66 says everybody who is a citizen of the Republic of Turkey is a Turk. But it doesn't make clear whether that is an ethnic term or that is a national term. And so Turks need to have a serious discussion about what it means to be a Turk and whether it's possible to be a Turk in a national sense, separate from being a Turk in an ethnic sense, because that discussion really hasn't happened.
Yeah. Well, I would imagine it's kept purposefully vague so it can be interpreted however people want.
I was going to say, it's if we look at the Republican Party policy, that's the CHP in 1930, there are actually numerous quotes about this because it deals with the integration of the Muslim minorities. After after the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, you had a lot of migrations from the Balkans into Turkey and from what's today the Caucasus region, parts of Russia, Georgia, and so on, into Turkey. All these were Muslim migrants, muhajir. We're talking about Circassians, Laws on the Caucasian side. We're talking about Pomaks, Torbishi, Bosniaks, Albanians on the Balkan side. And it gets to the point where you have roughly 17% of the Turkish population being these muhajir or these immigrants. And so there's a question of, are these people Circassians, Laws, Albanians, Torbishi, Pomaks, whatever, or are they Turks? And so the Republican Party policy at the time was that there is no such thing as a Circassian. There is no such thing as a Laws. There is no such thing as a Pomak. These are all lies. We are Turks.
They formed what percent of the population?
About 17%. To put that in
That's one in
perspective, that,
five. Yeah, that's huge.
yeah, I was gonna say that's about the same percentage as Hispanics count in the United States population right now.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Thank you.
All right, any further questions before we close this out?
No, thank you very much.
All right. I'll see everybody next week then.
See you next
All right.
week.
Bye.